Hey, everybody. Let me shut my door.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning. Good afternoon. Sylvia, just so that everybody knows, is joining us from Spain, where it's 3 p.m. instead of 9 a.m.
Mhm.
So if we're all bleary-eyed because it's morning and she's bleary-eyed because it's evening, then that's why. So we've got a couple of friends with us today. Joanna Lyle, I think Sylvia knows already. Rob, you may not have met her before. She teaches history and religion. She's going to join us today because she is our campus expert on Asian history. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to let her go first because she's got plans later in the morning. Roger is, I think both of you know Roger, I think.
Rob and I worked on
Yeah.
school board stuff.
Oh yeah, great, good. So Roger's a philosopher. He's going to talk to us about Plato a little bit. He's not an ancient philosopher, but he'll do in a pinch. And he's got an MDiv along the way too, so he can say smart things about the Bible. Before we do anything else, I just want to point forward to our next meeting, which is going to be on the 20th. Here, let me trim my my open windows just a little bit, and then I'm gonna just pop us over to Canvas where we can look at the assignments for the 20th, and then we won't have to mention that again today. What I've been doing yesterday and this morning is filling in some resources specific to each of the readings that we're doing for today. And this morning I've been trying to do some of that for next time, since I know doing it today is a little bit late. So this is today, of course, we're doing Genesis, Plato, Mencius, and Hsun. So I've tried to collate really all of the most relevant stuff and put it here for you to look back at as you're thinking about prepping your syllabus and seeing what there is that's relevant. Most all of this is from elsewhere in the Canvas page, but I wanted to put it in one place for you to be able to find it quickly. Let's hop back to home, scroll down past the context videos, and down to the bottom of the context videos, there's teaching resources. And that's a kind of master list of teaching resources for each of the readings. But again, I'm gonna collate them for you. Go down here under training. Era 1 is today, June 6th. Era 3, training 3, Era 2 is next time, June 20th. So we'll pop into that. And you can see again the Zoom link at the top. What I'd like you to try and read for next time is Pico della Mirandola. He's a Florentine writer of the early Renaissance. DeWitt is a Canadian scholar of the history of science. So he is not a traditional reading for us in the sense that he is not a contemporary writing about the scientific revolution, but he's got some really great material on worldviews. He wrote a textbook called Worldviews, and it does a really good job contrasting the Aristotelian worldview with the emerging worldview of the scientific revolution. This is not in our textbook. Unfortunately, because we couldn't afford the rights to it. I mentioned last time that if you chose to add something that was not in the textbook, that's your prerogative. I want you to be familiar with this stuff because we used it for about 5 years, and for most of us, it's been really helpful in forming the way that we teach the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution is in the background of everything that we do in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So Luther, Hobbes especially, both lean really heavily on the emergent scientific revolution worldview. And DeWitt is really the best place that I've been able to find for understanding that and teaching with it. I'm still on the hunt for something that's a good replacement for DeWitt, but in the meantime, we can read and talk about it for next time. It comes in two parts. There's a few chapters on ancient science and a couple chapters on the scientific revolution. When I say chapters, I mean like 4 to 6 pages in a freshman level textbook, so not heavy reading. After that, we're going to look a little bit at Luther on the freedom, on Christian freedom, on Christian liberty, various translations of it. Hobbes, our section of Hobbes is nice and tight. It is from Leviathan, but it is about 5 pages. It's the famous argument that human life, absent some power to overawe us all, as he says, absent a monarch in his mind, human life is nasty, brutish, and short. This is clearly a throwback to the kind of stuff that we're talking about in Era 1 about human nature, and really concretely ties human nature into what we see a lot of in Era 2, which is the emergence of political science and post-Platonic arguments about how we should organize our governments in the world based on an understanding of how human beings are. Hobbes is really useful for us because he ties these two things together really clearly, and because he has a nice tight argument structure, and so he's really good for teaching argument. Rousseau is an answer to Hobbes. Rousseau does not think we're so bad, and he has a more sort of liberated view of humanity and human nature. Also, he hates monarchs, so Hobbes and Rousseau read really well together. And then, of course, there's the relevant material from the Foundations 111 training packet. What we've got more time between today and the 20th. So what I'm going to ask you to do is put together one reading question assignment and turn that in, and I can give you some feedback on that. The other thing that I want you to do is to try and do the Hobbes argument assignment that the students are going to do, and do that as you're prepping the Hobbes. So you'll have firsthand experience sort of puzzling through the thing that we're asking them to do, and an appreciation for how easy or difficult it is. The answers to the Hobbes argument assignment are in the training packet, so try and do the worksheet before you look at the training packet on that. This one argument, there are other assignments that where you can decide whether or not you're going to use it or not, but this is one that basically everybody uses because it's tightly put together, and it works really well. Down here, I've listed various assignments that different people have contributed over the years. Argument assignments on Luther by Hadaway and Henkel, reading question set by Wargelin. When you're putting together your reading question set, don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Just liberal plagiarism of other people's assignments is perfectly fine if you like them. So, any questions about our next meeting on the 20th? Okay, we have a meeting the day after that on the 21st, and I'll try and start populating that training material starting, I don't know, this afternoon. So if you want to work ahead, which will be easiest, feel free to just poke into there and see what's there. Okay. All right. So let me close this then, and I'll I'll let Joanna say whatever she wants to by way of introduction to the Chinese material. Of course, with the understanding that our biggest concern is always pedagogical, and then we can talk about the material itself and approaches to teaching it. So, Joanna, regale us with whatever you'd like to.
All right, it's good to see you, Sylvia, and to meet you, Robert. I'm not really an Asian history expert. It's something I am learning, that I've been learning the past few years, and I've absolutely fallen in love with it. And so the first time I taught foundations, I didn't know anything about East Asian history. And then I started auditing some classes at UK so that I could teach it here. And so now that's helped me appreciate Mencius and Hsun a lot more myself. So John, do they have the same training packet that I would have had back in 2020? Yep. I'm guessing it's probably the same.
Same thing.
Okay. I wanted to point out one little mistake in the training packet. It's not a big thing. It probably will not affect the way that you teach at all. But I have, just in case you get into the context a little bit more deeply, I think in the training packet, it says that Chinese civilization began along the Yalu River. That should be the Yellow River. Oh. If we were in North Korea, they'd probably say human existence began along there. That's the center of civilization, but it's a different, entirely different river, the Yellow. So
do you know what page?
It's a major river in North China.
It's page 45.
45.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, I had assumed that maybe
well, my page is different, so it's not 45 in my training packet, but it's trying to find where that is. But it should be, I think it's just the very first page in the training packet that introduces Mencius and Hsun. So it's page 55 in my training packet. Yeah, so it's the yellow, like the color, because the river is yellow. So one other thing I wanted to say about the second philosopher, this is something I've talked to John about before. And this is something I would not have caught if I hadn't been able to go back and take some East Asian history class a couple of years ago. So Mencius is the first philosopher. The second one, Hsun, when I started teaching foundations, I heard everyone call him Sun Tzu. And so I was like, okay, I've heard of Sun Tzu. I guess this is Sun Tzu. And it's not. Sun Tzu is actually more famous than the guy we have in our training packet. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, but this is not Sun Tzu. And so it's not, it's not necessarily about pronouncing it perfectly. I don't pronounce any of these things perfectly. But the problem is when we tell students we're reading a philosopher that they're not reading at all. And that would never happen with a Western philosopher, I'm pretty sure, or someone from literature. So, so I'm going to write in the comments, maybe just sort of a phonetic pronunciation that might help. Let's see the chat. All right, so it's like Hsun Se, because the second part of his name, the TZU, that means master. So I just put that in the chat, Hsun Se. And you could if you want to call him Hsun Tzu, that's fine. Like it doesn't matter as much as long as you just don't call him Sun Tzu, because that's not who we're reading. All right, so I wanted to give maybe just a little, we never have a ton of time to do a lot of context or background for any of these readings. And I think there's a lot of good stuff in the training packet. I wanted to talk about Confucius a little bit. Not that you have to talk about Confucius a lot to the students, but there are a few things in Confucian philosophy that I think will help you understand where Mencius and Hsun are coming from. So both Mencius and Hsun were influenced by Confucius. And if you know from his name doesn't sound Chinese, and that's because he would not have been called Confucius in his own day. So I'm writing his name in the chat. So he's Kongzi or Kongfuzi, which just literally means he was called Master Kong, because again, that title Tzu or Tzu is master. So he was Master Kong. Later on, his name was Latinized by Christians who translated his works, and they had such high esteem for him that they Latinized his name so it'd be a little bit easier for folks back in the US and Western Europe to pronounce. So Confucius never definitively said whether human nature is inherently good or bad. And so that's why it was left for some of his students and people that came after him to try to use his ideas to make an argument one way or another. But we do know Confucius was really big into leading by example rather than punishment. He believed in creating a culture around honesty, and that was the best way to reduce crime and get people to act well. Think about the honor system that we have or that other schools have. That's kind of Confucian. He believed, though, that punishments just encourage people to lie about the bad things that they've done. So he believed rather than, holding threats over people's heads, threatening them with punishment, the best thing a leader could do was to live a good, virtuous life themselves, and then their people will want to emulate them. So with that said, Confucian philosophy, it's all about what you do. This is how it's different from Taoism. And you don't have to talk about Taoism. I would not recommend talking about Taoism at all. It'd be too confusing to introduce too much to the students, but it's all about what you do, your actions, your etiquette. That's what makes you good. And Confucius believed that there are three main virtues that every person needs to try to cultivate. And about 10 or 20 minutes ago, I just emailed everyone in this meeting a short email with a link to some very brief videos about these Confucian virtues. And I sent these to the instructors last fall. And so I just forwarded that email to Sylvia and Robert and Roger and John. I forwarded it to you all again, so you'd see that again as well. So it takes you to a page that has a lot of, very short videos. Most of them are like 3 minutes long. They're kind of dated, but they're really good. They're to the point. It's on a level that undergrads can understand. You don't necessarily need to show these context videos in class, but I found them personally helpful for me to understand Confucianism, which helps me understand Mencius and Hsun better. So I would encourage watching some of them just on your own, and then you can decide if it's worth showing them in class. But for Confucius, there were three main virtues that everyone needed to live out. So the first is filial piety. The second virtue is ritual. And the last virtue is sometimes translated as humaneness, being humane. So, thanks, John, for posting those. So do any of you all know what filial piety is? Have you heard of that before, or have any understanding of what filial piety might be? It's okay if not.
Filial
Some of
is
you are on mute.
filial is referring to a son, right? To a child.
That has to do with the relationship between children and parents.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the father-son relationship is really important there. Yeah. So it's all about venerating your ancestors. And that includes your parents who might still be alive. Ancestor worship is intertwined with this, but it also refers to venerating your older relatives who might still be living. And so this is something that is just really, there's nothing really that compares to that in our society. So it's really interesting for students to learn about this. So again, venerating, showing deep respect to your elders and those that have gone before you. And related to that, the next virtue is ritual. And some people think, well, how is that a virtue? When he's talking about ritual being a virtue, he's talking all about etiquette. And again, there's not a whole lot that compares very well with our society. But Confucianism, is all about, again, it's all about what you do. It's all about these, rituals of etiquette that you follow in social settings. And so that might include certain rituals you follow around your family members. There's a certain number of times that you would bow in front of your father, for example. There are rituals that dictate whether you make eye contact with someone or not while you're talking to them. And it's very important in Confucianism because following these rituals is a way of showing respect for other people. And again, he believes that these ritual practices will help make society better. We'll all improve together. And then lastly, the last virtue, humaneness, that's basically like treating other people the way you'd want to be treated. So all of these three virtues are related. And, again, it's important to kind of have that in the back of your mind, especially the fact that ritual is considered a virtue. It's important to know that because if you've already read Hsun, he's very repetitive and he keeps talking about ritual principles, the importance of following ritual principles. Well, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about this Confucian etiquette. He's talking about practicing filial piety. He's just talking about any number of large or small practices that you might follow when you're in any sort of social setting. And again, that could be something that sounds to us as simple as bowing, but it makes a big statement. And again, bowing a certain number of times, depending on who you're talking to, and honoring your family members. So, again, you don't have to necessarily spend a ton of time on this, but because Hsun keeps talking about the importance of ritual principles, it is helpful just to give some overview of the types of ritual principles he's talking about. Because when our students hear that word ritual, I don't know what might come to their mind. They might think of more of a religious ritual, but it's all about these social relationships. All right, so
Could I just quickly add
oh, go ahead.
to reinforce what Joanna is saying there, that regardless of how you do it, it probably is a good idea to spend some little bit of time trying to get them into a better understanding of the Chinese worldview before you barrel ahead with these readings. When Ellen Emmerich was our East Asian person, the point that she made was about the role of nature in the Taoist worldview, and for her, nature was what sort of a conformity of man to nature was one of the points that you needed to go into the Mencius with. Joanna's emphasizing different points, but I think the sort of broader takeaway is that some time spent helping them into ancient China, where they've probably never been before or thought about before, will pay dividends, because you're probably going to spend 2 or 3 days on Mencius and Hsun together. And both of them are responding to a Confucian worldview and philosophy. So I love these little videos that she posted. I posted them all and I broke them out into the three virtues that she was talking about. I think that sounds like a great way to do it. Anyway, thanks, Joanna.
Okay.
Back to you.
And thank you for mentioning the whole thing about, whether we can be compared to things in nature or not. I think that's really important to understand going into Mencius. And as you read in the training packet, another contextual thing I would definitely mention is that they're writing during a period called the Warring States period in Chinese history. This began with the collapse of the Zhou dynasty. It was the second Chinese imperial dynasty. And so this is a long period of civil war. And one thing that I like to emphasize with the students is that this is like a 200-year period of civil war and fighting. You know, we think about our own country's civil war as such an important, such a tragic part of our nation's story. And that lasted about 4 years. And this is about 200 years. So I would really emphasize that and, explain it's not surprising that we would see people reflecting more on human nature and wondering, is it possible to be good? Are we inherently good or not? And Hsun lived a little bit later. He lived during an even more violent stage of the Warring States period. And maybe that's why he had a darker view of human nature. And, I would definitely teach Mencius first. That's the order they come in the skills manual. I think it makes sense to talk about him first, and chronologically, he lived a little bit earlier. I would not recommend assigning both Mencius and Hsun for the same day and trying to talk about them the same day. I wouldn't recommend that. I doubt anyone does that, but I would not hurry through these readings. So with Mencius, I would definitely talk about each analogy, go through it very slowly, talk about each analogy one at a time. If you teach on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you might not have time to get through all of Mencius in one day. I've never taught Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I will be this fall, so I'll have to be reordering things a little bit. I think it's helpful to use visuals as much as possible with Mencius. And you don't have to be really elaborate here, but I try to show a picture of everything he's talking about. So I just show an image of a waterfall when he makes his water analogy. And then when he says, it's in water's nature to flow down, we have to apply force to make water go up. I show a picture of a fountain, and I say, this is what he's talking about. And I think it's helpful for students to stay a little bit more focused when they have that visual to go along with it. And then when he says, again, you have to dig a channel to force water to flow a different way. I show a photo of something like that as well. So that's just one little thing that I think, will help them. The same with when he talks about Ox Mountain and how, the natural state was for Ox Mountain to be this lush, beautiful place, but then through deforestation, nothing grows there anymore. I show side-by-side photos of what Ox Mountain might have looked like in the past versus like a wasteland. And I'm sure John and Roger can add some of the strategies they use here, but as you go through each analogy, talk about the strengths or the weaknesses with them, ask them if they feel like any of these analogies make sense or not. The most interesting one maybe is when he says, it's in water's nature to flow down. And, try to get them to really think about that. Like, is that water's nature? Or is it something else that causes the water to flow down? Is it something inherent to the water's nature? Or is it something else, maybe like gravity, that he didn't understand? So how well does that analogy hold up based on our maybe more, scientific understandings of things? I will say, with both Mencius and Hsun, when you start to ask students who they think makes a better case, they're going to tend to just agree with whatever viewpoint they already had going into it. And so you'll have to be really intentional about making sure that the discussion moves beyond that, because their immediate answer is just going to say, well, I like Mencius because I already thought human nature was good. Or, well, I like Hsun because I already thought human nature was bad. So with some students, it does take a little more work to get them to actually think about the validity of the arguments and the analogies and whether they're actually good or not. And then with Hsun, probably like most people who teach the class, I give an argument assignment over Mencius and Hsun. It works really well for that. I'm assuming most instructors do that, although some, maybe they use Augustine for their argument assignment for Era 1. And I don't know if you want, John, I could email that to Robert and Sylvia. I know there are a lot of great examples
please.
already.
Please.
The argument assignment I use is probably copied from someone else's. I can't remember exactly, but it's probably definitely based on something that someone else did. But what I do, and it's not necessarily right or wrong, is I give the argument assignment after we've discussed Mencius, but before we have talked about Hsun. So one of the questions they can answer based on notes that they took during our discussion of Mencius. And I think I just asked them to discuss one or two of his analogies. And those that have been in class and paying attention should do well on that question. Then the second question they have to answer more on their own. I asked them to identify two of Hsun's premises. And so that requires them to work on that without me, telling them ahead of time. And John, yesterday, did you already talk about those skills documents, like the arguing document? Okay, so you've already talked about that a little bit. Yeah, so, make sure that you have already gone over that document with them. That's the tricky thing about this class. There's a certain order in which you have to do some things. So make sure before you give any argument assignment, you've already talked about that document. And like with Mencius, with Hsun, go over each premise. Like, I think the training packet for me was so helpful, what Dr. Emmerich did with taking this reading apart. And, again, you can ask him if you feel like he's making a good argument, and, emphasize again, if any of these premises are flawed, that whole building can crumble. The arguing document we have talks about the columns holding up a building. I think the analogy in the document is like the Supreme Court building. I change that. I just talk about Giddings Hall because that's something they see every day. And so I talk about the columns in front of Giddings Hall being like each premise. And, we talk about whether any of them are strong, whether they feel like they're weak. And, they'll notice again that he's very repetitive. He keeps coming back to talking about these ritual principles. So again, you can remind them of the types of things he's talking about, like showing filial piety and the proper etiquette in their social relations. And, of course, he's arguing we don't do these things because we're good. These are the things that make us good. We have to follow this etiquette and these rituals to become good. But I found that, both of these readings generally lead to pretty good discussion. And they're documents that students tend to come back to throughout the semester. It's really good for making, connections throughout the semester. And sometimes out of nowhere, someone might say, oh, well, this reminds me, something that Mencius might have said. Mencius might have agreed with this person. I really like to come back to Hsun when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail, actually, because I don't know off the top of my head what page this is in the skills manual, but Hsun offers a definition of goodness, and I can't remember all of it, but one thing that he says is that goodness is orderly. Goodness is orderly. And so when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail, we talk about King's peaceful protests and the fact that King was, willingly, knowingly breaking the law. We say, well, what would Hsun have thought of this? And when we think about how he thinks that goodness is always orderly, what would he have thought of King? And is that a good definition of goodness?
And
so
Hsun, of course,
go ahead, John.
Our intro material on him makes a point of underlining his association with legalism, which failed fast, right? So he has this very negative view of human nature, and it leads him to be a proponent of a harsh government strategy, which was so harsh that it couldn't hold up. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his student Han Feitses took, I guess, things a step further and was, probably the most famous philosopher associated with legalism. Yeah.
Joanna, I
don't. Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
So so the content here is really clear. Like you're right, it speaks to students because it's a live question form. How did these two figures enter into Western consciousness? Why are we reading these particular figures? Because I know Thoreau mentions both of these authors in Walden.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so I didn't know if you have any insight into how these figures entered into. I mean, you mentioned that these Christian missionaries translated Confucius for a wider audience. Is that primarily, as far as you know, the vehicle for how these figures entered into the Western mind?
I don't know when. That's not something I'm very familiar with. I'm guessing it was in the early modern period and not before that. So that's interesting that Thoreau knew about them.
Yeah.
I could
And
probably find
Leibniz,
that out, but I don't know.
Yeah, Leibniz was also in 1700s writing about Chinese philosophy widely, and that was also a way of that Eastern religion kind of got grafted into sort of a philosophical worldview. He was really fascinated with Chinese thought and governmental organization. So maybe that's the route. I'm not sure how we got them.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I like these types of questions because it forces me to go back and do some more research and try to find the answers to that.
Thanks.
Joanne, I have a
And-
question about, about how you teach this. Since you taught them on Tuesdays and Thursdays, do you have time to fit both authors on those 2 days and have, discussions after on the second day?
I wouldn't recommend doing that. I think this last fall I had to do that because my mom had a mini stroke and I canceled class for a day, and so I think I had to talk about them, and it worked okay. It wasn't terrible, but that wouldn't be my first preference or anything like that. So yeah, normally I divide them up. Maybe it might work well for me, for what I do, talk about Mencius on a Thursday, then assign that argument assignment over Mencius and Hsun, where they have to read Hsun, and then talk about that on Tuesday, the following Tuesday. So yeah, I'm, off the top of my head, I'm guessing I may spend, definitely 2 days when I start teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I don't know if I'll need 3 full days or not. I don't know, John or Roger, how much time in total you spend on these readings on Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
I typically do 2 or 3 days on them.
Yeah.
Together.
Yeah, it takes.
I guess.
I agree with you. It takes a good class period to get their thinking into the context of having this question about, how we understand human nature. So that's one step. And then introducing the differences of opinion between Mencius and Hsun takes a second step. And then the third step is, what do you think about it? So it does take at least, I think, 2 class periods. But man, when you open up the gates, they really start to talk. And a lot of them, I don't know what, John, you may know this, but the percentage of students choosing to write their first thesis-driven essay, I'd say at least half of students write on this topic. I think just because it's so clear, it's a vital question to them. So you can actually teach it sort of knowing or anticipating that a lot of students will use this as one of their writing topics. So the work that they do on the argument analysis is going to become really handy when they get to that stage. So and they don't know that yet. So if you can kind of clue them in, sometimes you can say, if you work on this now, this will be really helpful if you decide to write later.
And for that same reason, if you know that kids are going to be writing on something, then by all means, tailor your in-class presentation to the specific prompt that they're going to be writing on, because they don't have a lot of independence at this point, and that's okay. So there are three for Mencius. There are 3 points that I really hammer and make sure that I'm clear about in class. Three different analogies. The first one is the water at the wellspring that Joanna was talking about. The second one is the seed analogy, which really underpins his whole approach to virtue generally. And when you talk to people about Mencius, the seed analogy is the thing that comes up. The third one is, I always try and use Ox Mountain as a way to talk about counter arguments. And at this point, I haven't talked extensively about counter arguments, but when he uses Ox Mountain, he's using it to answer an implied objection. Well, if human nature is bad, how does evil happen? And when I talk about this, I always make sure to make clear that that's what he's talking to. And that helps them to understand the role of Ox Mountain in his argument. They will struggle, though, with the logical role that last one is playing. So it really pays to spend a lot of time on that analogy and helping them understand that it's a way to help imagine how bad people come about, right? And what he argues is that bad people aren't born, they just happen over time by gradual sort of perversion of people's good instincts. And the role of qi in this is really important because he makes a point of saying that qi is like the dew, that it comes down every night and has this regenerating effect on all of nature, all of mankind. And that it's only by, like the dew comes down and waters the seeds every night and helps them grow back. And it's only through the constant working against this, which is habitual, right? Once you start down a path of habit, it's easy to continue it, that we're able to work against our nature. That the universe is trying every day to repair the injuries to our nature that we've ourselves committed. And we have to wake up every morning and, bring back the oxen to graze down the nascent sprouts of goodness, right? So in a way, it continues the seed metaphor that he's talking about in the middle, but it takes it to a new place that accomplishes something else for his argument. The other thing that I would say about Mencius that's really, really important to my success or failure with it, they really have to understand the 3 conversational positions that are going on in the dialogue, because it's essentially a dialogue, right? You've got Mencius's perspective. He believes that mankind is good. You have a different philosopher who believes that mankind is a blank slate, right? Gaozi believes that mankind is a blank slate. And those two are put in dialogue through a third person here who's a student, who is trying to figure these things out. And so you've got this discussion between Mencius and I think Gongduzi, the student, about what Gaozi says. And especially when you look at the wellspring, you've got 2 different views of mankind being contrasted. Gaozi, who believes that water is neutral, like human nature is neutral. And that actually makes a lot of sense, right? So he starts with this illustration of mankind as a blank slate like water, but he changes, Mencius changes the way that his student understands water. The student says, Gaozi says that mankind is like water. It's neutral. It just hangs out. And Mencius is saying, yeah, but water actually has a nature. Water goes down. And wherever you create a possibility for it to go down, it'll go down that way. But it's got a nature, just like mankind has a nature, which is goodness. So that first one is a really important place to make sure that your students understand the three sort of persons in this discussion. And the last one, Ox Mountain, is a really important way to talk about counter argument, at least for me. If I could add one thing about Hsun, it's to make sure that you're clear about his point about conscious activity, because he's making a really accessible and important criticism of Mencius. And he makes it several times. And it's one that a lot of students will understand and agree with, right? Mencius says that human nature is not something that is welded to us from the outside. It's something that we have seeds of, and the seeds are inherent, and they grow. Hsun says that goodness is actually something that you have to learn to do. And the example that he's using is potters, right? The relationship between a good man and his good action is like the relationship between a potter and his pot, right? The potter does not, by his nature, possess either the ability to make that pot or that pot already, right? It's a thing that he has to learn through conscious activity. And his production of that pot is not a feature of his nature, his human nature. It's a feature of his conscious activity. And likewise, he believes that the good man, that human beings come to goodness through conscious activity, right? They have to study and learn ritual from the sages. And that's a thing for Hsun that we do not by virtue of sprouts that are naturally welling up inside of us, but that we do through conscious study. As Mencius would say, it really is welded to us from the outside. It's a thing that we access from outside of us. So the basic contrast of the two of them, and they don't disagree so much as their titles suggest, right? It's not like their opinions about mankind's possibilities are really vastly different. But for Mencius, it's something that we've got the beginnings of. And for Hsun, it's a thing that we've got to go outside ourselves to get. And both of them believe in ritual. Confucius clearly believes in ritual, and both of them are Confucians. But it's, like so many other things, a matter of emphasis. Does that sound right to you, Joanna?
I think it's a good point to make that Hsun's not really that bleak. And some of the students might be more bleak than he is.
Yeah.
You mentioned the TDE. A lot of students will actually use this for their final project too, which they're completing, maybe 11 or 12 weeks after we initially talk about it. So, again, that's just more evidence that it does kind of stick with them. They continue to think about these issues throughout the semester, which is pretty cool.
I want to pop over to the Canvas page and show you a couple of the things that I posted. I use this, a lot of these early things I use in conjunction with They Say, I Say to practice sort of component parts of a skill. Early on in the class, before we start the thesis-driven essay, I have them do a handful of Canvas discussion groups that are pretty low stakes things. I use one with Hsun to practice arguing, but it's a Canvas forum where I just ask them to find the premises and find a couple of premises of his argument and write paragraphs that quote them. So this is after I've used the they say, I say chapter on quoting. I'm giving them practice quoting things and using Hsun's premises as a way to talk about conclusions and premises. And that sounds a lot like what Joanna was talking about doing. So I've got that in there. For Mencius, I posted some reading question sets, one of mine, one of Ellen's, an argument assignment from Cliff. For Hsunsa, I posted a few argument assignments, one from Hadaway, Wargelin, and Jay Castaneda. I'm going to pop into my reading question set on Mencius just to show you what I was talking about sort of hitting a couple of points along the argument for clarity going forward. I said yesterday, I always have an example answer at the top, and I've got a rubric down here. But I use my reading questions after talking about Mencius. So I'll talk about Mencius on one day. I'll have a reading question set on the next day. And I use it to help make sure that they're really clear about the most important things for Mencius that they're going to need to write a paper on. I think the fact that I make sure they're really clear on this contributes to a lot of them choosing to write about Mencius for the thesis. I've got one question about context that asks about those three conversational positions. And it's something that is in the text already. And so I'm just making sure that they are following with things, that they're doing the reading and paying attention in class. But it's according to the introduction, what is Gaozi's belief about human nature? And how does that help you understand his claim that water is, human nature is like water bubbling up at a spring? What is Mencius's belief about human nature, and how does that help you understand his reply? And these are things that we will have gone over the day before, but probably some of them, it will have gone over their head. And this is a time to regroup and help them understand. Or if you're using it, if you give them the reading question on the first day they do the reading, this is guided sort of progress through the important points. For me, question 2 on structure is about the plant growing from seeds analogy. Question 3 about interpreting is about Ox Mountain, and I'm asking them to how does Ox Mountain help explain the evil of some men? And then for question 4, I'm asking them to engage with this on their terms. Do you believe that human nature is naturally good like Mencius, or that it's a blank slate, because we haven't gotten to Hsunsa yet, like Gaozi? They are prone for question 4 on engaging to give really short, dumb answers. They will say, I think that human nature is good. And they will think that that is a full paragraph answer. So I always make a really big point of emphasizing in class before they do it. To answer question 4 well, they need to defend their answer. It's really common to get even like pretty good answers for the top 3, and then a really shitty half-assed answer for number 4. So that's just one example of what you could do with Mencius. There are other, there's a reading question set from Ellen. She was our original content expert on Asian Civ. And like I said, there are other example stuff here on Mencius and Hsunsa. Your students will continue to say Sun Tzu here, and some of them will be insistent. So you got to just insist right back at them. Any more questions for Joanna before we thank her and send her on to Lisa for the day? No? All right. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I hope that we'll be able to make it work next year too. Say hi to Lisa.
I will. I had one other thing
to
add. It's just something that you reminded me of when you were talking about the conversation with Gautza, and I think it is really important to talk about why does he structure his piece this way rather than just diving immediately into the analogies. Why does he structure it this way? So I would definitely be intentional about that. But kind of related, I also wanted to point out, just as I said that some students will say, oh, Mencius is more convincing because I already shared that view. They also will sometimes say, well, Mencius is more convincing because I just like the fact that it's a conversation, or I like the fact that he's making analogies, or they'll say, I don't think Hsun says is convincing because, he kind of repeats some of the same phrases over and over again. And it's different things. It doesn't necessarily mean in the end one is more convincing than the other. They may like the way that they've composed the writings, but sometimes, again, that it bleeds into them saying, oh, well, he's not convincing because he didn't make analogies, or he's just not convincing because he's repeating himself. And so again, sometimes we have to get students to think a little bit more. You might have found this one boring to read. A lot of them find Hsun more boring, and it's longer than Mencius. And so then sometimes that means they find it not convincing. And so again, those are just some of the issues that can come up when you're getting students to try to analyze the readings. But yeah, I mean, it's good to have these conversations early in the semester. So I really like that this is part of our era 1. All right. So thanks, John.
All right. Thank you, Joanna. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Ciao. So we're doing things in exactly the opposite order that makes sense chronologically. But I just do want to mention before we leave the Chinese stuff, the question of man's nature being good or evil is something that's going to stick around for the rest of the course. It has to do with Hobbes. It has to do with all of the political science, Machiavelli, if you do Machiavelli too, in era 2, but also in era 1. If you're so inclined, a third piece that I always use with Mencius and Hsun is Augustine. So the Genesis, which we'll circle back to in just a minute, obviously also relates to this question of goodness or badness in specifically the Judeo-Christian tradition. Augustine also is very tapped into this question of man's goodness or badness, and has an answer that's kind of a third way, a lot like Genesis already does, but for Augustine, mankind's goodness is something that's in tension with original sin, and that's obviously something that you can use as a commentary on the Genesis stuff. If you started with that, I typically start with Genesis. I do Plato, Hsun, Mencius, Hsun, and then I go on and talk about Augustine. And what we've got from Augustine, if you're inclined to read and use this, we've got some material from book 2 where he's talking about babies. And he's making an argument that's surprising to most students, that babies are in fact sinful. His definition of sin is different from what they expect. His definition of sin is disordered loves, that your ethical priorities are out of the order that they should be in. And the order that they should be in by Judeo-Christian teaching is to have God at the top, your neighbor probably second, and yourself third, like all those stickers that you see in Lexington, I am third. His point about babies is that babies simply can't have anything outside of their immediate experience of self above that they are developmentally incapable of doing that. And although that is appropriate to them, we can see that theologically as a developmental expression of original sin. For Augustine and for the Christian tradition, mankind is born into sin through, he sees it as kind of like an STD that's transmitted from Adam and Eve, which is, a little bit weird and silly, but when you look at babies, you can talk about how they are like this and they can't help it, and that's not their fault. But we can also see that as a sort of cosmic expression of this disorderedness that's inherent in human nature. He goes on, and our reading has two selections, one from chapter 2 on babies. No, it's book 1 on babies. Book 2 is on how he was a crappy little kid, and all he wanted to do as a little kid is make trouble, and that was an expression of his sinfulness in pretty obvious ways. The trouble that he wanted to make was to steal fruit, so that's an obvious sort of pair to stealing the fruit in the Garden of Eden. But we go on in book 8. He's talking about his conversion in book 8, and book 8's wonderful, and there's much that's really rich and fantastic in there. The basic takeaway from it is that he wants to convert, but he doesn't find himself able to do it on his own. That he is intellectually converted, but he can't really have a conversion of the heart without God's intervention. And if you're going to read Luther later on, then this is actually really helpful. Luther is an Augustinian monk. Luther has a lot invested in Augustine's understanding of human nature and sin. For Augustine in book 8, we see him trying to convert. We see him listening to somebody else's conversion story and unable to do likewise. But then he has an experience of essentially divine intervention through a book, that he hears a voice telling him to pick up and read a book that's in front of him. It's a voice that sounds like a children's song, but no kids read a song that says, pick up and read, pick up and read. And when he picks up the Bible and reads, the passage that he picks it up to is tailor-made for his life. And so he experiences here divine intervention that makes the difference in his attempt to convert. And the reason why this is so important is that Augustine believes that because of original sin, we cannot choose good actions without grace, right? And what grace is defined as is God's unmerited forgiveness and favor, right? That we can't earn. And the idea that we can't earn it is something that's going to be really important for Luther, because Luther, in rejecting the Catholic Church and rejecting especially indulgences, rejects the idea that our merits can make the difference in our salvation. And that's really, really important for Luther. It's important also for Augustine here, because he believes that because of original sin, we can't choose good by our own goodness. We don't have the ability to make right moral choices. And that's in contrast to, what was the guy's name? What is it?
Hsun.
No. The guy that Augustine is talking back to. Anyway, there's a contemporary theologian that he's arguing against.
Oh, Pelagius?
What's that?
Is this the Pelagian?
Yeah, Pelagius. So there's really good material in the training handbook from Jonathan. He's an Augustine expert. Everything I know about Augustine I learned from him, but I use it every year because I think the three of them, Mencius, Hsun, and Augustine, teach really well as a kind of triangle, because you've got mankind is good, you've got mankind is evil, and then you've got the Christian view, which is more complex, right? Creation is good. That's really clear from the first half of Genesis, the Genesis creation story. But mankind is sinful in ways that he can't get out of himself, but he can with God's help. So it's interesting, and is sort of a third way. You don't need to use it. Lots of people don't use that at all. I really like Augustine, and so I teach it as a sort of triad with these things.
And I think in that TDE complex, Augustine's one of the figures that people write about fairly frequently. So
I used to have a lot of people that really like to write about Augustine. Lately, because our free school for local kids program has kind of changed our demography. I've had fewer people writing about Augustine in the past few years than
I think that's because instructors are using it less. I'd be curious. Yeah.
I just mean in my class.
Yeah,
I've had fewer people writing about it in my class.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's circle back and talk about Genesis. Roger, do you want to lead off, or do you want me to lead off and you weigh in?
Either way, if you choose.
Well, you start out, and I'll say whatever you got.
Yeah. So, Sylvia's been at Georgetown for a little while, and kind of, I'm curious what she understands about like a first year Georgetown college student's religious worldview. Do you see that, Sylvia, in your teaching? What they believe about the Bible or something like that?
Some of them, yeah. I hear that they're really interested in religion.
Yeah.
And they mention that sometimes in class. And I had one student last semester who was majoring in religion. So I see the students are deeply connected with that discipline.
Yeah. And Rob, I'm sure, being in the public school system for a long time, you're very aware of what students bring with them from their homes.
Oh, absolutely. Here in this particular community, very fundamentalist. It's a lot of the students have visited, are very impacted by really like the Ark and the Creation Museum, and the churches really take hold of that, and it puts pressure on our school system.
Right. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because when I begin, this is the first reading that I have that's in our book. And so people are bringing in all kinds of things with them. And it's really interesting to know kind of their background, how they're reading, and they're not even thinking about this text as a text so much as this is just the way things are, and this is the important stuff. So one of the first thresholds in my experience is to present the reading of the creation story, and just let them kind of sit with it for a moment, and actually read it out in class. It's not very long. It takes about 8 minutes to read the entire text. And then the first thing to show is that there are actually two stories. So you get the 6-day creation story, and then here's another story, and it's the garden story, and the sin and fall. And when you are able to display that just on the board or whatever, and to say, what's the creation story? Which one of these is the creation story? And they have to say, well, there are two. Then all of a sudden you're using their own text to raise a question that probably many of them have not really thought about. And so you can use that dialectic between one story and the other to begin to let them raise questions about their own understanding of the text. And that's really, in my experience, that's crucial, because if you're raising a question about their text, they'll be very defensive. But if they're raising a question about their own text, it'll be a whole different story. So then I was talking to John about this yesterday. My first move, once we get to the two-story kind of thing, I say, what are some of the elements in the first story? What are some of the elements in the second story? And then ask, why do you think the person who wrote the words down in the first story wrote them in the order that they did? So what's the editorial function of putting words together this way, as opposed to putting words together in this other way? And so then they begin to think, well, someone's making choices about what content to place and an order. So one of the things I spent a good bit of time on, I picked up from a scholar from Hope College a long time ago, is about the days of creation. So if you think about the 6 days of creation, there are in the first 3 days, there's a creation of space, of the heavens, the skies, and the land. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, those spaces are filled, stars, birds, and animals. And so it's a bringing to order, more than a creation out of just nothing. It is bringing something to order. One of the books I've found recently, and I'll put this up on the Canvas thing, is a book by this guy, John Walton, who is actually an Old Testament scholar from Wheaton. And Wheaton, if you know much about evangelical world, Wheaton University is a very conservative Christian place. So if you tell a student you're referencing a book by a guy at Wheaton and they know anything, they'll say, oh, okay, I can trust that. But his language, and he does this is the lost world of Genesis 1. And he's taking apart this notion that Genesis 1 is about bringing material stuff into existence. He says this is not what it's about at all. It's all about ordering. It's all functional. So all the words that are used about God creating are bringing things into function. So when the spirit hovers over the water and it's all confused, chaotic, it's not functional. And what the ordering spirit does is bring everything to order. And he actually calls this a cosmic, it's a cosmic temple inauguration. So it's like God is coming to this disordered place, bringing it to order and making it into a temple. And that last scene where the work is complete on the 7th day and God rests, it's not that God quits working. It's like an authority who has brought a disordered organization finally into some functional order and then is able to sit back and just let it run. So that's kind of the image of the 7-day creation story. And you're welcome to, if you want to borrow this or look at it, I'd be glad to let you look at it. That fundamentally shifts the way that they read the story, because they come in already loaded for bear. You know, if you're attacking Genesis 1 as a scientific text, then they're gonna, they're already gearing for that because they've been to the Creation Museum. They know what's up. But if you work the angle that this is a literary constructed story, emphasizing some aspect of how some power has brought what's chaotic into a functional and productive order, that coincides with what they understand, and it's a little less scary. The second part of that creation story, of course, they already know about the fall. What they haven't thought is about why the first creation story has mankind come at the very end. And in the second creation story, mankind is at the beginning. So God blows, makes a critter out of dust and blows air into it, brings it to life, and then invites that human into the creation process. So God creates and names, and then the first thing it invites the created man to do is to join in the process of naming. So this is an engagement of the creation into a co-creative function. So that really puts a different twist on the fall. So it's not that God created humankind in order to make them fall, but that God invites this created being into participation in the created order, and then that created being decides to opt out of that participation. So in fact, we had a seminar last week, and one of our former students who's teaching adjunct English is doing some work on hospitality in the texture like Chaucer, that time period, medieval world. And he said, even in the Genesis account of the second story of the garden, when God shows up, the fact that Adam doesn't rush out to say, welcome, come in, is a sign of inhospitality, because you always welcome the stranger. And so when Adam hides, it'd be like, if your aunt comes to your house and you go hide in the bathroom instead of going out to say, hey, welcome. So there's a reduction of hospitality that is an indication of the disorder that Adam and Eve are reintroducing into the system. So they've chosen against the order God has created and invited them into creating, and they're selecting for disorder. So that's how I tell the sin story, in a way that kind of avoids a little bit of the, we're just made sinful. Students will say we're all sinful. They don't know what they mean by that, except that's what their preachers always told them. That's what their parents have told them, and they probably are. But when you put a more context into saying what does sinful mean, it means you're choosing an order that you're imposing on the world rather than the order that God imagines for the world. If they can make that jump, it turns out to be a whole different text.
Roger, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Maybe this is a stupid question, but did you ever get tackle this story from a women's perspective, in the sense that if are the students interested in that? Because in my literature class, I talk about Lilith, and Lilith, it's considered the first woman instead of Eve in another account of the Genesis. And I always tell the students how Lilith was punished by God, and she becomes a demon, and it's because she didn't want to submit to Adam's wishes. And I don't know if students are interested into that.
Oh yeah.
Or
yeah. No, I mean, and when of course in the traditional story, I mean, it turns out, it's pretty clear that Eve is the agent who is persuaded by the serpent to break the command, and then Adam is convinced by Eve to also participate. And then you get this kind of blame game when God says, why did you eat this fruit, Adam? And he says, because Eve, the woman you gave me, handed it to me. So, and this will come up especially in texts like Christine de Pizan, another figure that is it's no longer in the reader, but still available. She's specifically looking at the animosity or the separation between male and female, and it goes back to this creation story. And so I point that out. One of the founding moments that our culture has referred to in terms of why we think of men and women as different has something to do with this story. And they're very interested in it. Yeah. In fact, a lot of if you have students who are resistant to reading Christian scripture as a part of an academic course, one of the things they'll say is that it's misogynistic. And so I think it's good to acknowledge that certainly this is one of the texts that was widely drawn on to justify why men were superior, even though when you read the text, Adam just hops right in. I mean, he doesn't give any argument. He doesn't, put up any resistance to following the lead.
I would add that, like a lot of our texts, it doesn't take much to do something useful and even so let me put it a different way. I don't want to discourage you from getting into things that seem usefully controversial, right? Like by all means, use those as much as possible. But on the other hand, especially early in the class, and if you use this, you'll be using it first. What you're doing is, by and large, looking for ways to illustrate a skill that you've introduced. And the first skill is always reading. And so here in this first, either you're about to introduce reading, in which case you're trying to set the stage for talking about the 4 reading skills, or you've just introduced reading, in which case you're looking to give them introductory practice using these reading skills that they've just learned, right? And so when Roger was talking about the 6 days and the 3 and the 3, that's a structural reading, right? Genesis 1 is really good for structural reading because there are a lot of really simple conclusions or observations that they can make or draw themselves, and feel empowered, right? So you can ask them, looking at Genesis 1, what is the structure of this piece? And clearly the answer is it's divided into days. And they'll say a couple of things before somebody says that, but that's the really important first sort of structuring principle. And after that, you can go into other things like 3 days of space making and 3 days of filling or something like that. But there are a lot of really basic sort of exercises that you can do with Genesis that they give them practice using the skills that we've just introduced, and that sort of lead them into the academic treatment of a religious text on their own. So Roger's talking about a lot of the sort of resistance problems. I think he's more attuned to those than I am. I'm an ancient world guy, and so I barrel headfirst into the ancient world context stuff. And I've never had too much trouble with that, but the reaction of most of our defensive students is to just quiet down. So I wouldn't notice if I was having that problem, probably. But when I teach this class, I do a lot of work with context. Terry Clark is the guy that is our Old Testament expert. He wrote the brief materials in the training packet on Genesis 1 and 2. And the work that he does with it is largely about the Babylonian context and its relationship to the exile. There are a lot of, let me put this a different way. Very few of our students have ever heard of the Babylonian exile. And so the work to get them to make smart observations about the context is actually pretty high. And you can use different kinds of resources to do this. I've posted a couple of things. Terry uses this article by Bridge, The First Creation Story, Is It True? I don't use that whole article. I think it's a little bit much. If you wanted to spend a few days and sort of make a stand on, hey, this is a text that you're familiar with, but you've never tried to approach it academically. Here's the way that we do this. It's pretty accessible for them to read, and you could have them read that article and then come in and talk about it on day 2, right? On day 1, you could say, hey, let's read this together. I'm going to send you home to read this article. And on day 2, we're going to talk about how that changes our understanding of it. The other thing is that you could do something like Brad and I both do and sort of point them to relevant material and try and bring that in. I think Brad does a better job of this, so I'm going to show you his reading questions here. So here we go. Brad sends them to a UGA page right here for his first question, which is context. He says, go to the following website and scroll down to find the link to a summary of the Babylonian creation myth about Marduk. It's called the Enuma Elish. Here's your link. Some scholars have suggested that the Old Testament's creation story about Adam and Eve was compiled during Israel's Babylonian exile to serve as a contrast to their captors' Babylonian creation story. After reading the summary of the Babylonian story about Marduk, identify and explain 2 significant similarities and 2 significant contrasts between that story and the Genesis account of creation. So this is reading with context in mind. I do a similar thing. I give them a little handout. I think his probably works better. But what you can do with this is get, if you've told them, or if they know that the exile exists, you can get them thinking about the way that this first story functions to help the Hebrews in exile keep their identity when everybody around them worships a polytheistic set of gods and counts time in a totally different way and worships in a totally different way. The easiest thing in the world, and what happened to most of the Israelite tribes, is to go to Babylon and assimilate, and that's the end of it. The ones that eventually come back after Cyrus frees them are the ones that didn't assimilate. And not assimilating seems to have required a pretty big effort, and especially celebrating the Sabbath every 7th day. And so when you look at the first creation story, its structure is day by day in a way that culminates in the 7th day of rest, which is the thing which, if the Hebrews are in a foreign land, this is the thing that's really going to mark them as different from everybody around them. That every 7th days, and Babylonians, the 7-day week is a Hebrew invention, right? Babylonians don't have it, Romans don't have it, Greeks don't have it. They don't have weekends. They don't have Sundays off from work. They count time in entirely different ways. They just take festival days off from work. So the Hebrews are living in a way that is utterly distinct and apart from the way that everybody else around them is. And if you want to talk about the function of this text, and in its original composing context, one of its functions is to help the Hebrews keep being Hebrews by keeping the Sabbath. This may be getting too deep in the weeds for you for something so early, but the 2 creation stories, when you talk to source critics of the Old Testament, come from 2 different traditions. And the 7-day creation story seems to have been composed after or during the Babylonian exile. It's actually the later of the 2. The earlier one is the Adam and Eve story. And the Adam and Eve story has an entirely different function from the 7-day creation story, right? And the function and the again, you can look at structure and use structure to draw interpretations, right? If I'm trying to return to the language of teaching reading, I'm going to ask them, what is the structure of this story? And they're going to have a hard time answering that. But the answer is something like, well, it's centered around this act of disobedience, right? It's a story about the first sin and its consequences, because the very end of it is its consequences: the expulsion from Eden, toil for man and labor for women. And if you're asking them to notice that, you're asking them to notice that it's centered around the first sin, right? The question of mankind's fidelity to God and obedience to God. And that makes a much more basic point about the religion, right? That this is a monotheistic religion. God is sovereign. Our role as Hebrews is to respect God's authority over us, which is essentially the point that the entire Hebrew Bible makes. But you, like I say, you're going to be in sort of shallow water so early in the course, however you choose to use it. You can make forays into the deep stuff if you want. You don't have to, but you can also just use it to get kids to practice the reading strategies in ways that advance the sophistication of their reading of the text. And that's the basic point you want them to walk away with, is that by using these reading strategies, which is what we're teaching you in this class, you are getting more out of this text that probably is pretty important to you already. And you're able to understand things about it that you weren't able to understand when you just listened to it as a story and thought that it was part one and part two of the same story. I use a Canvas forum with Genesis, and I ask people to summarize the two stories to support one or another view of whether mankind is good or prone to bad behavior. I say, keeping your opinion in mind, write one paragraph that argues your position based on a summary of one of the creation accounts, right? So I'm asking them to practice condensing the material in a way that supports a claim. And that's the point that the They Say, I Say chapter about summaries makes, is that we're always using summaries for some purpose. List summaries are useless. We need summaries to be rhetorically useful. And for that, we're always using them to support something. So at this point, I've had them read They Say, I Say chapter 2, and I say, now summarize one of these two stories in a way that supports your view of whether mankind is good or bad. And that, of course, is going to be one of the TDE questions for TDE 1, is based on Genesis, do you think that mankind is basically good or bad, or good or prone to misbehavior, or however you want to phrase it? Roger's point about sort of staying away from their sort of aggressive understanding of the word sin is probably a good one. You don't need, and like I said about Augustine, you don't need to understand sin as, malicious harm to take the point about obedience and just sort of fidelity here. I don't know, Roger, is there anything else we should say about Genesis?
Probably enough.
Do you guys have any concerns or questions about teaching it? You don't have to teach it. I would say that half or more of us do use it because it's a good intro part. No. Okay.
It's often what I also find helpful, especially for students in their, in a class where they're unfamiliar with their fellow students at this point in the semester, and they're trying to bridge who they were before they come to college with who they are now in college. They're a little more reluctant to leap right into the I think this about the text. So I often give them the opportunity to provide an explanation of what somebody else thinks about the text. What have you heard about this text? What do people that you know something about this text? What do they say about it? And sometimes their ability to talk about what other people say or think about the text provides a little bit of an opening. So they can kind of introduce their ideas in the voice of some other, so they're not fully committing themselves to a position. That'll change in the context of the course, but at this initial point, I think they're trying to figure out their position in relative space with these other students and with you, and so they're probably going to be a little more cautious to just jump off and say, here's what I think about it. So you have to kind of create a little safety zone where they can talk about it from other people's opinions, and then begin to do their own work, like John's saying, summarizing to develop, and then it goes a lot easier.
Yeah. It probably bears mentioning, Rob, since you've been in the public school system for your career, that the context here is a different one, and that because it's a Christian college, we are not forbidden from talking. I don't know quite what the sort of nuances of trying to teach something like this in the public school would be like, but we don't have any trouble talking about religious texts or themes as religious, and our students, many of them will have come here sort of seeking that, which is not to say that you have to talk about any of these things in any kind of devotional way, but they'll probably, many of them at least, will expect a sort of more of an openness to if they have a devotional relationship to the text, they'll expect a sort of friendly reception to that, which we're good at doing typically. Let's talk about Plato. Maybe I'll lead off on this, and Roger, you can provide the corrective. So I'm an ancient guy. I'm not an ancient philosophy guy. My specialty is in Rome instead of Athens. But Jonathan's our guy on this stuff. He's a little bit too busy. This is below his pay grade nowadays. What we have on Plato. Well, let me start a different way. We've got two texts from Plato in our reader. We've got the Apology and a selection from the Republic, the famous allegory of the cave. Both of these are really central pieces to the Western intellectual tradition. I read them both. You don't have to do them both if you don't want to. They're a little bit shoehorned into our current theme. They aren't quite about are people good or bad. They're doing something different. They are trying to convert you to an interest in the way that a reflective thinking relationship to the way that you live your life. They are protreptic, as the philosophers say. They are trying to turn you to the way of philosophy. And both of them are doing the same thing in different ways. The allegory of the cave is this fantastic little piece of Plato's Republic, and I use it basically just to talk about what education is, and to get them to agree that it's a good thing even if it's hard, because the position that Plato's cave dwellers find themselves in is that they've been brought up in the dark and they are experiencing reality in this two-dimensional, very gray, colorless way. But it's fine because it's all they've ever known, right? And this is a great analogy for the uneducated life that 18-year-olds are typically living, right? A life that's full of interests and diversions that are basically superficial. And they will understand that if they read this. The training packet, Jonathan makes a good point of saying that it really helps to get them to draw this, send them home to read it, ask them to draw it or an adaptation of it, so that they have to read carefully and understand sort of what the physical positions of things are. Some kids will come in with a really good drawing and you can use that drawing to teach with. But you're gonna get them to see that essentially we're chained in a place where we can just see shadows of stuff, and that the real reality is not just on the other side of the wall we're chained to, but it's in fact outside of the cave, and it looks entirely different from this. And it's hard to look at because we've been living in a cave and our eyes hurt if we go out. Also, if you go out, it's really hard to want to go back in. If you go out and you let your eyes acclimatize to the truth, real reality out there, which we hope that college is going to help you do, it's pretty hard to go back into the cave, because why would you want to? It was crappy and dark down there, and the people down there don't know anything, and I don't want to see them anymore. But Socrates makes the point, and this is actually a really good point to make for you when you want to emphasize the idea of vocation and help kids think about their life's calling, that there's some obligation or some possibility of obligation beyond your own self-satisfaction, beyond your pleasure and lack of pain. And that if you have opened your eyes to reality, you have an obligation, despite the pain of it, to help other people, to use that understanding to try and help other people. I've thought for a long time about trying to use this at the very, very beginning of the class, to use this reading as the reading that frames the whole class for me. And I don't know if I'm going to do it quite this year, or if I'm going to read Genesis and then do this before doing the apology. Typically, people read the apology first, and it comes first chronologically, but I think I'm going to start my Plato at least with this, because it can be used so thematically to help kids think about the project that we're doing in this class, and to connect that with their relationship to their lives. And that's a thing that increasingly is going to be central to the college's mission, because this idea of doing good for the world is going to be a part of our new mission statement, and that's our job to help put into practice. So that's just a couple of words on the Republic selection. You don't need to do it justice. You just need to use it to talk about to talk about their lives and their relationship to them. If you want to talk about forms, this comes right after Plato talks about the realm of the forms with the divided line. More power to you. It's hard, but you don't need to do a good fun job with the allegory of the cave in one day. You don't need even to talk about or mention forms. You can just talk about the idea that there is a higher kind of reality than the day-to-day junk that we focus on, and that will make sense to them right away. Let's talk then about the apology, because the apology is a thing that our students, people have read the apology as a key point of liberal arts education forever, right? This was This was central to even the Romans' understanding of philosophy, of intellectual history. Socrates is the first intellectual martyr in Western history, right? He lets himself be put to death in order to underline his claim that the rest of the Athenians are living like dickheads, essentially. It's very, very effective. He's an old guy. Old guy life in Athens is no fun. He's an ugly old guy too. He never minded being ugly. He's very charismatic. But if you read Xenophon, the other account of the Apology, there's two. There's Plato's account, and then there's the historian Xenophon. And Xenophon takes seriously this question of why Socrates doesn't try harder to win. Plato just sort of uses that as a sort of driving element of satire in the whole thing. Xenophon takes it seriously, and he says, well, I'm old. Why would I spend any effort trying to prolong my life in the worst part of it? If doing that required me to compromise my ethics and my morals. Obviously, for both authors, the key point of his defense is that he is uncompromising about his ethics, his own personal choices, and the way that he thinks that Athenians should live their lives. The trial itself takes place in 399 BC. And the context of that trial is pretty important. The democracy was in place for 100 years by now. So the Athenian democracy is around 100 years old. And Athens flourished for many of those years. The 5th century BC is bookended by two important wars, though. You got the Persian Wars at the beginning, which sort of establish which the Athenians win, despite overwhelming odds against the Persian Empire, which is huge. But the Athenians see this as a vindication of their political ideology of freedom, because they are all free men fighting for themselves. The Persians, the political ideology of Persia is that everybody is a slave to the king. So although the Persian king has hundreds of thousands of men as cannon fodder, they are all fighting as slaves. And these slaves lose at the Battle of Marathon, despite overwhelming numbers, to the free Athenians. And the Athenians see this as a vindication of their system. And for almost 100 years, they really flourish. The 5th century is the golden age of Athens and of Greek intellectual life, really. During that 100 years, we get the development of history as a genre. We get the early development of philosophy. Plato and Aristotle are after that 100 years, but we see in Ionia, we see the pre-Socratics. We get most of tragedy. The best parts of tragedy and the early parts of comedy are during this time. So great time. At the end of it, however, by the end of it, the Athenians have developed themselves into a hegemonic empire. And they have basically taken over the Aegean Sea. And the Spartans have started leading a sort of resistance to that, and they fight a war. So at the end of the 5th century, we get the Peloponnesian Wars, and the Athenians lose. And they are essentially destroyed as a political and military force. The Spartans take over. They institute they briefly institute an oligarchy. That oligarchy was the rule of 30. It's mentioned in the training materials. It lasts very briefly. It's thrown out. The democracy is restored, but things are very, very different. And 399, all those things have just happened. And so there is less of a taste for, let's say, intellectual freedom than there was 30 years ago. or even 25 years ago, to put it in terms of the first accusers and the second accusers, because when he makes his speech in Plato, most of the speech is organized around what he calls the first accusers and the second accusers. The first accusers essentially means pop culture, and the bad reputation that I, Socrates, have because of my representation in pop culture, in particular by the comic playwright Aristophanes. In The Extant Clouds, we have this play. It's very funny. It depicts Socrates as a weird, skinny, pale guy who lives in basements and never comes out into the light. He walks on clouds because his philosophy is so rarefied, and he trains people to do despicable things with rhetoric. He trains people to make the worse argument the stronger. For Aristophanes, Socrates is essentially a pastiche of all of the stereotypes of an intellectual in the 5th century. And most of the things that he is describing describe either pre-Socratic philosophers or what the Greeks called sophists, who are traveling rhetorical professors. Sophists were actually really popular in the 5th century, and not as bad as Plato describes them as, but Plato spends a lot of time in all of his works skewering the sophists because they attach the project of higher education to rhetorical success. And in Athens, it's actually really important that you're a good arguer. It is less important that you're always right than it is that you can make yourself believe. And so because of the democracy, the skills that you need as a young man, the skills that you need to learn are persuasion, primarily. But the sophists can teach persuasion as a thing that is separate from the truth. And this is the thing that Plato really nails them for over and over and over again. This is what he calls making the weaker argument the stronger. This is what Athenians call that. And this is a thing that objectively is despicable. Aristophanes, in this very funny play that we still have that you can go read, has an old man who is in debt try to enroll in Socrates's thinkery, his frontisterium, and he's too dumb to learn because he's old. So he sends his son, who is an appropriate age for education, and the son learns how to make the weaker argument the stronger. And he comes out and successfully convinces his dad that I, the son, should beat you up, Dad. And he beats him up. And then, and the father is convinced. And this is obviously a perversion of truth. The only thing that stops him is that then he tries to argue that I should also beat up Mom. And at that point, his dad stops him and beats him up, and the whole burns down Socrates' house. But it's an illustration of obviously the dangers of rhetoric, that you can convince people of such perverse ideas that sons should beat their fathers. This is what Socrates means when he talks about his first accusers. That 25 years ago now, Aristophanes put on this play that's all about how big an asshole I am. And for the past 25 years, my whole reputation has been driven by this very funny play. So when I'm here defending myself, I can talk about my second accusers, but really I need to talk about the thing that drives what you guys think about me, which is my first accusers. And I can't even talk about them without even mentioning that one of them is a comic poet, right, which he says. So the structure of the piece is 3 speeches, but the first one is the guilt or innocence phase of the trial. The second one is the penalty phase. The third one is the goodbye phase. He gets to make a little speech to the jury after he's condemned. So there's 3 speeches. Students won't recognize that. You have to help them understand that. You can assign it on different days if you want. Inside the first speech, the long one, which takes up most of it, we have a basic division into first accusers, second accusers. And then there are different parts that are appended to that basic structure. There are a couple of really famous stories. The one is about Chaerephon, who went to the oracle at Delphi and asked, who's the wisest? Or he asked maybe, is anybody wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said, no, nobody's wiser than Socrates. And then Socrates doesn't believe it. So he goes around asking all the different people about, to discover in what way they're wiser than him. And it turns out that nobody's wiser because everybody else thinks that they know things that they don't know. I, Socrates, alone am wise because I know that I don't know anything. Right? This is the famous human wisdom, or Socratic wisdom, is the understanding that you don't know very much, or that you don't know anything. The second section, which includes the actual charge against him. He's answering a charge by Anytus, Miletus, and the third guy, Lycon. That he commits blasphemy against the gods, and that he corrupts the youth. He answers this in sort of rhetorically slippery, but typically Socratean ways. For example, about corrupting the youth, he answers it with a line of questioning about who improves versus corrupts horses. Right? Is it the case that everybody makes horses better and only one guy makes them worse? Or is it that only one guy, the horse trainer, makes them better, and everybody else, if you gave them a horse, they would make them worse? And he's trying to make the argument that I, Socrates, am like that. The gadfly image is also, I don't know if it's in this section or in the second to last, that he says that I am like a gadfly that the god has sent. In Kentucky, it helps to say horsefly, right? Because they know what a horsefly is. And the state is this great noble steed that's sluggish and needs somebody to come and bite it on the ass to make it move. And that is me. And by God, if you swap me, you're not going to get another gadfly very soon. So I teach this in a way that's a little bit different from Jonathan's approach. Jonathan talks about sort of the key philosophical points, like the life unexamined isn't worth living. That's really important. I don't talk about it enough. I talk about the structure, I talk about the context, and I use this for an introduction of argument. All of us, I think, maybe to a one, use the apology as our first argument exercise. And here it is. It is based on the argument that he makes in the second to last speech. He's in the last speech. The page numbers are wrong now. It's not page 89 to 90. The pages are, oh, I'm in the wrong place myself. The page numbers are
143 and 4.
143 and 4, thanks. There we go, 143 and 4. And we're just going to ask them to look at one paragraph. And that is a very important constraint on asking them to start thinking about argument. Because arguing is really hard. We're asking them to do some high-level structural thinking. What details in this paragraph support a conclusion? And what is the conclusion that's being supported? So say the word structure a bunch of times, focus them on this one paragraph. And in this one paragraph, we're going to ask them, what is the main conclusion? What is his main claim? And he says there's reason to hope that death is good. Question number 2 says, what premises or reasons does Socrates offer to try and make his listeners believe that death, understood as a lack of perception, is actually an advantage? 3, identify and write out another key premise in the argument. Finally, try and describe how this argument works in a paragraph. So we call this telling the story of the argument. Last is evaluate it. I never get to the evaluate step in class, but it's important. The first steps take a long time to get them through. I teach a 50-minute class. 1, 2, and 3 take me 50 minutes to get through, because the answers to 1 and 2 are bad. And I do this in groups all the time. So like I've got 4 or 5 groups, people working together. They cannot figure out what is the claim that's being supported here. This is great. This is fantastic for learning, because they see other people making different mistakes than they make. And we get to evaluate, does that sentence that you put your finger on, is it supported by all of the other details in the text in this one paragraph? And we've only got one paragraph, right? We can go back to it and make them read it again and again. So this assignment, and there's a different version of it that this is out of date. I'll update it. But this one assignment is one that I think most of us, maybe all of us, use as a really early exercise on argument. Roger, what do you want to add?
So, like John, I emphasize the context. Once you can lay out, I draw a little timeline on the board and have, the beginning of the war, where Socrates is born, where the war comes in, where democracy is replaced by the 30 for a couple of years, and then democracy restored, and then the trial. And you see that, as soon as the Athenians got back into power with their democracy, one of the first things they had to do was to deal with Socrates. So I point this out, that, what people say and think and how they understand their role in the state becomes really important as a function of kind of, where we're going to go from here. And the Athenians are trying to think, where do we go from here? And handling Socrates is one of their primary things. If you understand the 30 and some of the figures that Socrates references, you'll see this is a political document all the way through. Socrates puts himself on the side. He says, you're associating me with these 30, the tyrants that the Spartans put in charge. But in fact, I oppose them as well. I fought for Athens as a free soldier, just like you did. So I'm patriotic in the same way that you are. And I've resisted political influence in a number of different ways across a couple contexts. So there's a really interesting little political backstory that you can build here. But when it really comes down to how Socrates sees his role with and in relationship to the state, I think that's really crucial. That John's notion of the gadfly bit is exactly right. There's a passage, and it's on page 142, and I have this marked in my text. And there's this really nice rhetorical turn where Socrates moves from defending himself against claims or charges, and he says, now let me do this another way. I'm going to give an explanation of what's positively motivating me. And if you scroll down there, John, to the bottom of 142, and now men who have condemned, I'm sorry, hang on. I'm on the wrong page. Hang on. Ah, 130. Sorry, go back to 130. Someone will say, "Are you not ashamed, Socrates, of a course of life which is likely to bring you to an untimely end?" To him I say, and he goes on, "Whoever calculates the chance of living or dying is not really living, but to serve the truth, doing right or wrong, is really the important thing." And this begins his positive argument about his way of life. And it's a very interesting rhetorical switch when Socrates goes from playing defense to basically playing a kind of offense. And this really resonates with students. Reading this passage, I think, really connects with them because they're looking for themselves for something meaningful to do. And here's a great example of it. Now it gets them killed in the end. So, you have to, if you're going to be convinced about what you're doing is right, you have to understand the political context and understand the consequences.
It's one of the two places where he likens himself to Hercules and Achilles too. And
absolutely.
That's a strategy that he comes back to throughout the speech, that like, I'm Superman, damn it. Like, you look at me and you see this ugly old fat bald man. But I am Achilles. I am Hercules. I am better than them because they only make you think that you're happy while I make you really happy. So he's making these outrageous claims in ways that are probably really funny, but that are designed to make you privilege your ethical choices over everything else, including your life.
The kind of rhetorical structural piece that I do is I use the assignment that John pointed out, the argument about what is death. It comes at the very end, and Socrates is saying, everybody's afraid of death, but why? What can death be? There are a couple options. You might just be lights out and never have another thought, in which case, is death bad? If it's just like utter night of sleep you never wake up from, or it's transportation to some other place like Hades or heaven or hell or something like that. So death could be a couple of different things. In both cases, it's not necessarily bad. But what's fascinating is if you take this focus of death that seems to come out of the blue at the very end, and then you have students look back into the document. From the very beginning, Socrates has been referencing death the whole way through, and they just gloss right over it. They don't pay any attention to it. But if you say, go back and just, underline or circle the sentences where Socrates says something about death, and you realize he's been talking about death the entire way through this argument. And when you string all those together, you realize that those statements and ideas about death and how life can't be lived in fear of death, but must be lived according to some other good rather than fear, then you see how this argument has been building up the whole time. And it happens and they don't even realize that this argument's been building up in their own reading to support this argument at the end. And it's really fascinating when they realize they've kind of been nuanced into this understanding or thinking about death in a way that they didn't even realize had been happening. It's just really cool. And then they get to argue about death, and they all want to go to heaven, and So they like this transportation argument. So they have a little bit of, coherence with Socrates at that point. But it's at least really interesting for them to think about this fundamental understanding that as humans, we're strangely conscious that we're going to die. And how we use the consciousness of that fact about our very existence and our moral lives really shapes how you live. And when you see how that conviction shapes how Socrates lives, it makes a great philosophical point.
Roger is doing the thing that philosophers do better than me, which is concentrating on the really important philosophical points in this. It's worth saying that that's really important to do, because I get lost in the trees on this, and I miss the forest sometimes. There's a lot of work to do to help them understand what it is that they're reading. And
John, the most fascinating thing for me is I just have them read it, and this is the assignment: underline what you find interesting or compelling. And when we go in class and we sit together and they start pulling out the things that they found compelling, all the other students find exactly the same passages compelling.
Yeah.
And they realize, hey, we're all reading this individually, but we're all sharing in some of these ideas. And it's just really interesting how they gravitate to these ideas of meaning and purpose and courage to live to truth, so.
I wind up doing a lot of let's talk about the context. What does first accusers mean? What does second accusers mean? And I think I sometimes kill the joy in it for them when I'm doing that. I might have to rethink the way that I approach it so that I can let them do your part first and then go back and do the part that I'm talking about.
If they get invested in the context for themselves, they'll have a lot more connection to it.
Yeah, that's good. So since we've got this this text in front of us, this is the one paragraph that we're talking about. Let us reflect in another way, and we shall see that. And here's the conclusion. There is great reason to hope that death is a good. Right. It has three premises. First premise: it is one of two things. Either death is a state of nothingness, or it's a change and migration of the soul from one place to another. He goes on to support each one of those with the sub-premise, saying, if you suppose that it is no consciousness, then death will be an unspeakable gain, because you like sleep. He goes on to say, now, but if death is journey to another place, and there everybody resides, what could be greater than this? Because I love talking to people, and I could just talk to people forever. And he comes back at the end. I'm pretty
Can I say something?
Yep.
These figures that he mentions here are really crucial. These are the Athenians' own ideas of judges in the underworld. And so Socrates is saying, you think you're going to send me to death to face these judges. I'm going to go to death and talk with these judges and get them ready for when you show up.
Moreover, he says true judges, because he's drawing a contrast with the people that are going to condemn him, who he does not consider to be true judges, right?
Yeah. It's an argument from force. Go ahead and kill me, but it's going to turn out bad for you if you do that.
Yeah. So it's a pretty simple structure. The kids will have trouble finding those three premises, a lot of trouble. And if they do, they will also have trouble evaluating the premises, even though they believe in hell. Clearly, that's the major flaw of this argument, is that it doesn't account for the possibility that it's transportation to a bad place. That's the easiest one for our students to understand, for sure. But they will miss it because they're so used to deference to a text. So we've got a small sandbox. It's really useful. It's a really tight little argument. It's a bad argument, which we don't usually get. Socrates makes a lot of bad arguments because he's trying to be provocative. And he doesn't think that he doesn't really want to win. He wants to make himself a martyr more than he wants to win. And he talks about all the things that he could have done to win. Like, I could have brought my kids down to weep for me, like all you losers do. And he calls the jury losers, essentially, for doing that, provoking them to kill him. And he does all kinds of provocative things like that, because he's not trying to win. And in fact, he does not win because he does all these things.
Well, let's be clear. Who wins here, John?
Yeah.
We're still reading
win.
his story.
We all win. The Athenians win in the end because they learn from this, because Plato makes this into a condemnation of the judges instead of Socrates. And he does it with this subtlety and light touch that makes Plato so hard to read and analyze, because Plato would have been a poet if he hadn't met Socrates.
Yeah.
And his writing has all of the subtlety and art and humor and grace of poetry. And that makes it really hard to analyze as philosophy sometimes. But it makes him really successful in converting people to believing his points. Read Plato's Symposium sometime, and you'll see some of the most poetic prose you could ever imagine. It's beautiful. Anyway, do you guys have any questions about Plato? Teaching Plato?
Don't fear it. Just embrace it and read it. Read it as you would if you were a freshman in college, and it'll come alive for you.
It's hard, but it's really wonderful. Yeah.
I had to read it. Sorry, when I was a junior in high school.
Oh, that's great.
They made us read the Apology.
Yeah. And some of our students will have gone to high schools where they read some of the material that we've got in here. And that's great for two reasons. One, you can celebrate them, and two, you can try and help them engage with the text in more sophisticated ways too. This is one that sometimes people have read. Homer's Odyssey, sometimes people have read. A lot of times they've read King's Letter from Birmingham Jail. But that we can use that. Well, if we don't have any more things to talk about, we're done early, which surprises me. That's wonderful. Let me close this and pop back over to what we'll do next time. So this is, move you guys. You guys are in the place I need to get to close this. Nuts. That's not going to work. Anyway, so it's the stuff that we were talking about at the beginning. We'll read a little bit of Pico about the Renaissance. We'll read Martin Luther about the Reformation. The Luther, I'll tell you, is one of the harder readings that we ask kids to do. The Hobbes is hard, but it's short. The Luther is challenging, and it's about twice as long as the Hobbes. As grown-ups approaching it, you'll see the argument structure pretty clearly, and that'll carry you through it. It can be hard even still the first time that you're reading it. The Hobbes, like I say, is a lot shorter, and so it's easier to grapple with. We'll do the DeWitts on worldviews, and I'll try and get a scientist to come next time to talk about those things. to talk about that. I'll see if maybe Brad or somebody will come and say a few words about Luther. And yeah, that'll be good for next time. Like I said, when we get to the end of the training, you'll have prepped about 2/3 at least of the material that that you need to teach the class for the first time. So apologies for giving you homework in the summer. I'm sorry to put you out, but it'll help you down the road. Let me know if you got any questions. I'm going to be out of town for a few days the end of this week, but feel free to text me and I'll always get back to you. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I will look forward to seeing you guys on did you type something, Rob, that I'm supposed to see?
No. I was just opening up my microphone to say.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it's fun to do this, and I'll look forward to doing it again with you guys on the 20th then. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Roger.
much.
See ya.
Thank you, Roger.
See ya.
See ya.